Blessings of the Triple Gem. Teruan Saranai. Welcome to another Sutta meditation series, Dhamma livestream. Heartfelt good wishes to everyone joining today. Today we are continuing with part 2 of our study of the Potaliya Sutta. So this is Majjhima Nikaya discourse number 54. Yesterday in part 1 we covered the first half of the Buddha's teaching to Potaliya, and we contemplated the 8 things that help us to develop the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to noble retirement, so nibbāna. The focus of today's session is on the Buddha's instructions to Potaliya on how to achieve noble retirement entirely and in all ways. It's a very, very deep teaching that will pull together many things that we have covered in other sutta meditations. And if you haven't looked at some of these sutta meditations yet, don't worry. You can follow these up offline and in your own time. Remember, this part of the Buddha's teaching is on how to completely liberate and achieve noble retirement entirely. So it's advanced level stuff. And remember the Buddha's encouragement, just as the great ocean slants, slopes, and inclines gradually, not dropping off abruptly, so too is this Dhamma and discipline. The penetration to final knowledge occurs by gradual training, so anupubbha sikha, gradual progress, which is anupubbha kiriya, and gradual practice, anupubbha patipada, so not abruptly. So that's from the Pahārāda Sutta. So the main thing about this particular session is to feel inspired and encouraged to practice whatever you can, and to lean into the Buddha's teachings and towards the ultimate goal, the cessation of all suffering, nibbāna. So let's begin by paying respects to the Triple Gem. We can bow our heads and anjali. Homage to the Buddha. Homage to the Dhamma. Homage to the Noble Sangha. So what we'll cover today, again, we'll start with how to get the best out of this session, usual tips and reminders. We'll go over the Buddha's instructions on how to achieve noble retirement entirely and in all ways. And we'll look at the Buddha's pathway of renunciation and the principles that we'll need to apply in this meditation. So we looked at this when we looked at in the Mahācattārīsaka Sutta, and we went to Saḷāyatanavibhaṅga Sutta. And so that's going to be very helpful here today. So we'll recap that. And then we'll deep dive into the 7 similes of the Buddha to understand the danger in sensual pleasures. And we'll link in what we did yesterday into those similes. And of course, the Buddha then teaches Potaliya that one can accomplish the 3 knowledges as part of this training. And then we'll end with the Buddha's final question for Potaliya and his response. And we'll close the session with the sharing of merit and the blessings. So how to get the most out of this session? Keep an open mind. That's probably one of the most important things. Be open and attentive to the Buddha's words in this discourse and the instructions we'll go over today. The main thing is to ensure that we keep establishing the right view and we develop from there. And be okay with not understanding everything. Maybe only what we need is a little, and also maybe we need to solidify what we've learned already and grow from there. So whatever you understand and can practice in this session, maybe that's all that's needed right now, and the rest will come later when you make effort. Remember that we're all learners. We're here to lean on each other, to make effort towards developing the noble path, and we're walking this path together. Apply yourself to the meditation, so really give yourself the opportunity to practice, even for that short while that we have short meditations, because that's the best time to at least try and connect with the Dhamma. And use your own examples, so that's the way we connect, as we've said before. And when we see the Dhamma, we see the Buddha, and when we see the Buddha, we see the Dhamma. And have good wishes for everyone who is joining today, those who are online, and think of all the people that have helped us to come to this path up to this point. As we discussed in yesterday's live stream, the Potaliya Sutta is without a doubt one of the most powerful teachings of the Buddha to a layperson, a householder. The Buddha highlights a way of developing the body virtue, mind, and wisdom as part of developing or generating the Noble Eightfold Path. By developing in this way, lay people or householders were able to practice towards noble retirement. So yesterday we went through the Buddha's teaching in brief and also in detail of the 8 things that we need to develop in order to develop this path leading to noble retirement. And we did short meditations on each thing, so non-killing of living beings, taking only what is given, truthful speech, non-divisive speech, no greed and covetousness, not insulting with anger, non-affliction with anger, and non-arrogance or non-conceit. So by the end of the session, we had purposely and consciously activated the Noble Eightfold Path using the Buddha's instructions. In today's live stream, we'll be delving much deeper by going into the Buddha's instructions to Potaliya on how to achieve noble retirement entirely and in all ways. So the Buddha says to Potaliya, these 8 things that lead to the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline have now been expounded in detail. But the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline has not yet been achieved entirely and in all ways. And Potaliya responds by saying, Venerable Sir, how is the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline achieved entirely and in all ways? It would be good, Venerable Sir, if the Blessed One would teach me the Dhamma, showing me how the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline is achieved entirely and in all ways. So our focus will be on understanding the Buddha's 7 similes on sensual pleasures and being able to contemplate them correctly with proper wisdom. This is so we can overcome sensual pleasures by attaining to the higher concentrations. So the first is the simile of the skeleton of meatless bones. The second is the simile of the piece of meat. The third is the simile of the grass torch. The third is the simile of the charcoal pit. The 5th is the simile of the dream, the 6th is the simile of the borrowed goods, and the 7th is the simile of fruits on a tree. Now these similes have been referred to in other suttas as well. For example, in the Alagaddūpama Sutta, this is the simile of the snake, Majjhima Nikāya discourse number 22. And there's a longer list that is referred to for sensual pleasures there, 10 in total, and these 7 are included in that 10. And there's also similes explained in the Mahāniddesa by Venerable Sariputta, so we'll reference that, what he has to say about these similes as well during this session. Now, when the Buddha gives instructions on sensual pleasures, the Buddha would usually state that sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and that the danger in them is still more. And then he would give one or most of these similes as a way to contemplate them and to gain direct insight into what he means by that statement. So clearly here in the Potaliya Sutta, the Buddha is showing Potaliya that desire or craving for sensuality is a significant obstacle to noble retirement. And for most people living in the world, sensuality and the desire for sensual pleasures is not seen in such a way. And this is because of wrong view, pervasive in the world. The question to ask ourselves is, why do we have misconduct or the lack of virtue? What is motivating us to do unwholesome or unskillful things? And the answer comes down to sensuality or sensual pleasures, because we are conditioned to think and believe there is much gratification, little or no suffering, and little or no danger in sensual pleasures. And we have undertaken and will undertake misconduct such as killing, stealing, wrong speech, and breeding mental defilements as a result of that idea or belief. And the sensual world that we inhabit is highly imbued with the wrong view about sensual things. So when we make contact with the world, which is most of the time for householders, then we're continuously conditioned towards sensual pleasures, wrongly thinking there's beauty, we can make it last, we can enjoy much pleasure, and so we take it as me and mine. So it's good to reflect that the wrong view is what led to this birth, that we craved sensual pleasures. We were born with these kinds of bodies, with sense faculties, for the purpose of seeking pleasure through our senses. And as we've said before in other sessions, we're born as pleasure seekers. So you can see how that connects. And if we don't see the truth about sensual pleasures, we can expect to be reborn over and over again, and the result may be an unhappy destination, particularly if we have this wrong view and when we have misconduct, so we lack the virtue. As householders, we live closely with sensual pleasures, with sensuality. And we saw this in our last Uposatha Dhamma session on the Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Sutta. There are attributes of household life that poison the mind or can poison the mind. And this is what prevents us from reaching higher concentrations and from making spiritual progress and understanding this Dhamma. So when we talk about what the Buddha is going to show Potaliya, then what he's given Potaliya and us as well is some of the strongest medicine with regard to sensual pleasures in these similes and the 8 things we contemplated yesterday. If we contemplate correctly, then what we're training is in higher virtue, higher concentration of mind, and higher wisdom. So in Pali, Adi Sila, Adi Citta, and Adi Panya. This is part of developing this noble path. So Venerable Sariputta in the Mahanidesa, he explains that we can overcome sensual pleasures in 2 ways. The first is by elimination or withdrawing support. So in Pali, it's called vikambana. And this means we withdraw support for sensual pleasures by way of the jhanas, so right concentration. And the second way is by cutting off or destroying. So in Pali, this is samucceda. And we do this by way of noble attainment. So when we contemplate these similes in the Potaliya Sutta, what we're saying is that we overcome sensual pleasures by elimination or withdrawing support for them by way of entering the jhanas and the higher concentrations. This means we become, as it says here, secluded from sensual pleasures and secluded from unwholesome states, and therefore this is part of the higher training in concentration of mind. And what we did yesterday in terms of cleaning up our virtue is part of this higher virtue. So it helps us to then practice this higher concentration of mind. And as a result of what we contemplate, then we get to the higher wisdom as well. So when we look at this, the other way is that when we have this gradual training and we realize noble attainment, so this is what Buddha was saying is samucceda, when we're doing that, we develop the path of stream entry. So we've all heard about stream entry. What one does is one cuts off or destroys sensual pleasures that lead to a bad destination. So that's why when people say it's a kusala thing, it's a wholesome thing to want to attain path and fruit, it's because you eliminate completely that which leads to bad destinations. So a sotapanna, someone who has the fruit of stream entry, is no longer bound for a bad destination. When it comes to the path of once return, one cuts off or destroys coarse sensual pleasures. So that's even more that one is destroying. And then when one develops the path of non-return, then one cuts off or destroys residual sensual pleasures. And then the final one is one develops the path of arahantship, one cuts off or destroys sensual pleasures entirely and in all respects without any remainder. So when we lay it out like that, it's truly amazing what the Buddha is actually teaching us and how amazingly complete it is. So to achieve noble retirement entirely and in all ways, meaning right liberation, which is the end of the complete tenfold path, we need to follow the Buddha's instructions to Potaliya and gradually train, progress, and practice. So before we deep dive into the similes, it's good to go over the Buddha's pathway to renunciation. And for those who have been through the Uposatha session on the Mahācattārīsaka Sutta, so that was Majjhima Nikaya Discourse 117, and this is how we develop the Noble Right concentration with the Noble Eightfold Path. This will help to refresh the memory. And in that session, in order to fulfill right intention, we went through this gradual pathway of renunciation. And it was part of looking at Saḷāyatanavibhaṅga Sutta and the Buddha explaining about the happiness, sadness, and equanimity of household life, and the happiness, sadness, and equanimity of renunciation, and how we can use the higher path as the support to abandon the lesser path. And in that Dhamma session, we learned how this process or this pathway of renunciation is important and really fundamental to the Buddha's path of liberation. And the reason why we're refreshing our minds here is because we apply the same principles from the Saḷāyatanavibhaṅga Sutta, this pathway of renunciation, as we contemplate these similes of the Buddha in this Potaliya Sutta. So let's recap what the Buddha says in the Saḷāyatanavibhaṅga Sutta. So the Buddha states there are 6 kinds of joy arising from gain or based on household life. So this is the joy that arises from worldly gains and based on our 6-fold base. And then there are 6 kinds of sadness based on household life. And this is sadness or grief that arises from worldly loss based on the same 6-fold base. And also 6 kinds of equanimity based on household life. So equanimity that doesn't transcend our 6-fold base. And then on this other side, we have renunciation. So 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation. So it's the joy that arises from seeing it properly with proper wisdom, that whatever we experience through our 6-fold base is impermanent, it's suffering and subject to change. And then the 6 kinds of sadness associated with renunciation. This is the sadness that arises when we generate a longing for noble attainment. And we see others attain and we think, oh, when am I going to attain? And then 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation. This is where we transcend the 6-fold base. So we go beyond form, and this arises due to concentrating our mind. So the Buddha asks us in the Saḷāyatanavibhaṅga Sutta to understand all 36 positions. So I'm not going to go into any more detail here. There is that session that I mentioned on the Mahācattārīsaka Sutta, and then we also had a shorter extract just taking out that section where we discuss this particular part about understanding the pathway to renunciation. So you can look at that offline. So for each of the Buddha's similes in this Potaliya Sutta, if we're able to contemplate and gain direct insight that sensual pleasures provide much suffering, much despair, and there's danger in them, then the instructions in this pathway of renunciation help us to reach the equanimity that is unified. So this one here. And I'll go through how this actually works just briefly so that when we go through each simile, it doesn't seem like we get lost or anything like that. So the first one is, with the support of renunciate joy, we abandon and surpass household joy. So when we contemplate each simile, what we want to see is that sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, much despair. So what we want to do is overcome sensual pleasures by going through the simile by way of the jhanas or the higher concentration. So we get the pleasure of the jhanas or the higher concentration, and that overcomes renunciant joy, which is this joy that we get from sensual pleasures. Now, what we do then is, with the support of renunciant sadness, we abandon and surpass household sadness. So the household sadness is associated with sensual pleasures, and what we do is we say, well, we want to attain to the path. So this is kusala, this is a wholesome thing. So what we're doing is replacing an unskilled state of craving for sensual pleasures with a skilled state of craving for noble attainment. As the Buddha has said, it's a way of eliminating the sensual pleasures. The third one is when we use the support of renunciate equanimity and we abandon and surpass household equanimity. So renunciate equanimity is really better than household equanimity, because household equanimity, it hasn't transcended form or the sounds or the odors or the flavors or the physical sensations and the mind objects. But when we have renunciate equanimity, we clearly know that these objects, whether they're sight, sounds, odors, flavors, physical sensations, what have you, that they're impermanent suffering and that these are subject to change, so we're able to transcend them. There is insight, knowledge, or wisdom to clearly see that, and therefore we get the equanimity based on renunciation. Then with the fourth one, With the support of renunciate joy, we abandon renunciate sadness. So many of us forget and we get stuck in renunciate sadness. So we're sad that we haven't attained, or we see others attain, and all those sorts of things. And so what we are asked to do by the Buddha is, instead of lamenting, instead of worrying over the lack of noble attainment and the final goal of liberation, then the Buddha encourages us to develop the jhanas, to develop the higher concentration. So this is the renunciate joy. When we do so, we get to the gladness, we get to the rapture, we get to the happiness and tranquility. And it's through this way we overcome the renunciate sadness of not having attained, worrying about the final goal, etc. We actually are making effort. Then the fifth one, the Buddha says, with the support of renunciate equanimity, we abandon renunciate joy. So at this stage, the Buddha is saying, don't simply abide in renunciate joy. So what happens is, if you do so, you're strongly inclined to that kind of joy and happiness, and then it might reinforce a tendency towards it. And what we want to do, the Buddha says at this stage, is to incline towards nibbāna. And of course, renunciate joy is better than household joy. But the thing is, we don't want to cling to anything. The goal is still nibbāna. So even when the Buddha is talking about Potaliya, when we go back to the similes, you'll see that very clearly, that we want to abandon that in order to find something better. And so the Buddha says the better state is renunciate equanimity. So it's fourth jhana and above, because it's more stable. And when we do this, this is the equanimity that we're talking about. So not above, but the fourth jhana. So at the fourth jhana, we're not clinging to happiness. We're not clinging to anything that is having no happiness, and we don't shake. So there's proper equanimity. So then with the sixth one, which is here, this is with the support of equanimity that is unified, abandon equanimity that is diversified. So the equanimity that is unified is better than the one that is diverse. So we know this from the Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Sutta, the practice of looking at the elements. And we also know this from our practice of the Cūḷasuññata and how we looked at emptiness. And what the Buddha is overall instructing here as a reminder is that to completely abandon form, we need to attain to formless attainments. This is the equanimity that is unified. And so this is even more stable because we are going beyond form. And as we said before, these formless attainments have some of the characteristics of nibbāna. And so then the seventh one is the Buddha saying, is with the support of non-identification, abandon equanimity that is unified. So the Pali word here for non-identification is atamayatang, which literally means not made of that, or not consisting of that, or not I am that. And it's translated in the sutta as non-identification, but essentially what this means is the absence of conceiving any of the five aggregates as self, or belonging to self, not me or mine, not identifying with any of that. So what we actually see, even with all these formless attainments, is that they're constructed. We'll still fall from them. They're not nibbāna, and so we renunciate everything. So the final push is really towards noble retirement, the complete liberation, nibbāna. So that includes liberation of mind, so ceto vimutti, which we'll refer to in this Potaliya Sutta, and also liberation by wisdom, paññā vimutti. So it's when we see things as they really are, even all these concentrations, that starting from what brings us happiness to the mind, entering and remaining in the form jhanas, with that direct experience, we see that they're constructed. We go beyond the form and we enter into the formless attainments. We see those too are constructed. And so through our direct experience, we gradually build this process of renunciation, and we know and see directly for ourselves that we want to abandon that as well for nibbāna. So these are some of the principles that will be used when we contemplate the similes of the Buddha in this Potaliya Sutta. So that's a quick recap. But as I said, there are extracts that go into this in more detail, as well as the full session that we had on the Mahācattārīsaka Sutta. We can now deep dive into each of the Buddha's similes and also connect with them and how they connect with what we did yesterday. Now, before we do that, The way to learn and practice these similes, particularly after this session, is to go through each one slowly. Try to understand the deep Dhamma that the Buddha is teaching us in each one, and also learn and practice them all together, because there's a very powerful insight pathway in this sutta that we're meant to meditate on, that makes the mind stop in the correct way, with the right view. And this is a taste of noble retirement. And also we'll need it when we do Dukkha Patipada, Kipa Binya. So we need to know how to meditate on Potaliya as a way to also do the painful practice with quick realization. Now, learning these particular steps, it won't be easy initially, but over time, the benefit is substantial, particularly with respect to overcoming misconduct and the conceit or arrogance that pervades our life. Remember what we said yesterday, that there's a link between misconduct and having conceit, and through the conceit, we also have misconduct. So this is what blocks us from noble attainment. It blocks us from noble retirement and nibbāna. So by the end of this session, you'll come to realize what a really powerful teaching the Buddha has given Potaliya the householder, and fortunately for us as well. So the first simile is the simile of the skeleton of meatless bones. And for this one, the Buddha says to Potaliya, householder, suppose a dog, overcome by hunger and weakness, was waiting by a butcher's shop. Then a skilled butcher or his apprentice would toss the dog a well-hacked, clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood. What do you think, householder? Would that dog get rid of his hunger and weakness by gnawing such a well-hacked, clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones, speared with blood? No, venerable sir. Why is that? Because that was a skeleton of well-hacked, clean-hacked, meatless bones smeared with blood. Eventually that dog would reap weariness and disappointment. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to a skeleton by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified, based on diversity, and develops the equanimity that is unified, based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder. So what is this simile telling us? When the butcher tosses the dog that clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones, smeared with blood, or simply meatless bones, we'd expect the dog to attack those bones, start devouring them, hoping to sate its hunger. But it would taste the blood and keep gnawing and gnawing until it realizes there's no meat on the bones, and for all its efforts, that's been in vain. There's nothing there, and the dog remains hungry, tired, and very disappointed. The skeleton of meatless bones represents sensual pleasures. And Venerable Sariputta in the Mahanidesa says, sensual pleasures are like the chain of bones because they give little gratification. So we need to contemplate whatever sensual pleasures we gravitate towards. It is similar to this scenario of the dog and the meatless bones. We work hard, we study, we gain skills and qualifications, we get a job, multiple jobs, we even go into debt, we endure much pain and suffering in order to gain sensual pleasures. But like the dog, our efforts are ultimately in vain. We are constantly tired, upset, stressed, sad, disappointed when we work so hard, only to experience fleeting pleasure, little gratification. So again, all the things we contemplated in our session on Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Sutta, last Uposatha, they all resonate here. In our meditation, we need to see that sensual pleasures are hollow, they're illusory, little gratification, bahu dukkha, much suffering, bahu upayasa, much despair. So what we can look at here is this first unprofitable direction. So if you remember, these sensual desires, they're the physical nutriment. And we go towards them because we have the mental corruptional perversion, which is this vipallasa in Pali, that there's beauty, that there's attractiveness, or it's something that's pleasing to us, subha in Pali. This is our wrong view. Instead, we need to see them as they really are, that they're repulsive and not pleasing, asubha, that they're filled with impurities and subject to aging and decay. So this includes all the material and gross sensual objects and people. We are also included in the physical nutriment. And if we cling, then this sensual desire escalates, and we end up poisoned by the dart of lust. So when we get poisoned in that way, still thinking that there's beauty or something pleasing there, our consciousness keeps steading on form. And we end up going the wrong way. And this is going the wrong way due to desire. So this is not the desire for noble retirement or nibbāna, but it's out of ignorance and craving. It's desire to keep coming back for more of the same, coming to birth, to experience more sensual pleasures. And in the bigger picture, we remain bound to samsara and subject to rebirth and this whole mass of suffering. So this is the real danger that the Buddha is talking about in sensual pleasures. Now, if we can really contemplate and see sensual pleasures like the skeleton of meatless bones, it can be very beneficial because it helps us to overcome them. Now let's contemplate why the Buddha associates this simile with the misconduct of killing living beings. So when we look at how this world is constructed, as we did yesterday, and the way things work, there is so much killing happening for sensual pleasures. So when we build cities, for example, we clear forests and places that are inhabited by different kinds of living beings. When we farm, we produce food, and there's a lot of killing entailed with clearing all of that. When we construct buildings and roads, the same thing. When there are domestic disputes, crime, large-scale conflicts, the same thing. When people kill for sport, fun, cruelty. And from our own perspective, if we maintain the wrong view and don't restrain our unskilled physical actions, such as killing, then we would be like the butcher in this simile who kills. So why does the butcher kill? The butcher kills to earn money, to gain sensual pleasures, because the butcher sees beauty or something pleasing in killing for sensual pleasures. So he has sensual desire there. So he is going down this unprofitable direction. So we need to remember we have killed in the past for the same reason. Perceiving beauty, we wanted to gain sensual pleasures. So the question to ask ourselves, is it worth killing living beings for these sensual pleasures, this skeleton of meatless bones, if what we can expect is rebirth in an unhappy destination? And the answer is no. We want to give up any desire to kill to gain sensual pleasures. So by this we mean we want to give up breathing in to kill. We want to give up breathing in to pick up a gun. We want to give up breathing in to shoot the gun. We want to breathe in or give up breathing in to take up a knife or a tool that is going to kill. So when we recall from yesterday, we practiced with the support of non-killing of living beings. The killing of living beings is to be abandoned. So when we have a deeper understanding, we make the determination to develop non-hate. So this non-hate path, to give up the hate path. So this means we develop non-killing, having seen the truth about the meatless bones, and we give up killing. So if we directly gain insight into not killing, that means we don't breathe in to kill. So we get to the cessation of breathing. So we get to the cessation of inhaling and exhaling. So by this, that means we get to attain to the fourth jhana. And so this is how we replace household joy that is steeped in these sensual pleasures, and we overcome it with renunciate joy. We go to the fourth jhana. We give up the breathing in and out for killing. And so if we develop that further, we can get to the equanimity that the Buddha says is unified. So back to this slide here, the Buddha says you can, with proper wisdom, you avoid equanimity that is diversified. You get to the one that is unified. And so based on that, if you keep practicing this, you get to aim for nibbāna, aim for noble retirement. So again, to recap, if we give up any desire to kill to gain sensual pleasures, we give up the breathing in to kill, we give up the breathing out to kill as well. And so when we really see, we see nothing in these sensual pleasures, they're the meatless bone, then that's how we attain to the fourth jhana. And that's how we start to develop this meditation. So let's do a short meditation now of this simile of the skeleton of meatless bones. Turn the simile in your mind and then relate it back to the non-killing and what we said yesterday. And if you truly give up breathing in to kill, then what happens is we end up giving up. We end up reaching the fourth jhana because there's a cessation of inhaling and exhaling. Okay, let's do this meditation for a few minutes. Okay, you can come out of the meditation. So it's a very short one. It's probably not long enough, but at least you get an opportunity to connect with the Dhamma. So the second simile is the simile of the piece of meat. And here the Buddha says to Potaliya, "Householder, suppose a vulture, a heron, or a hawk seized a piece of meat and flew away, and then vultures, herons, and hawks pursued it and pecked and clawed it. What do you think, householder? If that vulture, heron, or hawk does not quickly let go of that piece of meat, would it incur death or deadly suffering because of that?" "Yes, Venerable Sir." "So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to a piece of meat by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, and develops the equanimity that is unified based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder." So what is this simile telling us? In this case, one bird has seized a piece of meat, and other birds pursue with the intention to steal the piece of meat. There can only be pain and suffering for the bird trying to hold on to the piece of meat because of the risk of attack, injury, or even death. And so the piece of meat represents sensual pleasures. Now, Venerable Sariputta in the Mahanidesa says sensual pleasures are like the piece of meat because they are shared in common with many. And we can see that played out in the world, where we are conditioned to compete or fight for a share of sensual pleasures. So, for example, fighting over a share of food at the family table, demanding a wage or salary increase at work, getting into disputes with siblings over inheritance, competing with other applicants to get the position at the company to earn that money, fighting a war to gain land or territory. And there are many other examples. Just as we went through in the Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Sutta, we experience pain and sadness from trying to guard or protect our sensual pleasures, from kings or thieves making off with it, or fire that burns it, or water that sweeps it away, or hateful airs. It's like the birds trying to make off with the piece of meat from the other bird. And when there are quarrels, brawls, and disputes with fists or other weapons, then it may result in death or deadly suffering. And we've heard the Buddha say in the Anenjasapaya Sutta that unskilled mental states such as covetousness, ill will, competition, they arise on account of sensual pleasures, obstructing us from training and developing in the noble path. So if we don't see sensual pleasures clearly, then all we do is breed mental defilements because of them, and then other actions follow. So we've got to remember that sensual pleasures and sensual perceptions, they're in Mara's realm, Mara's domain, Mara's bait, and Mara's hunting ground. So the challenges we face regarding sensual pleasures and sensual perceptions is really great. What we need to contemplate is whatever sensual pleasures we gravitate towards, it's similar to this piece of meat. It's shared in common. And what is also important to see is the first bird stole the piece of meat in the first place. That piece of meat wasn't given to the bird in the first place because that bird in this simile is not a pet with an owner who gives it food, or like the butcher who tossed the dog the meatless bones in the previous simile. And those other birds pursuing it are coming to steal as well. So if you remember what we discussed yesterday with regards to the Buddha's supramundane right view on taking what is not given or stealing, we said only the monk or nun who lives by collecting alms food, so a pindapatika, bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, they fulfill supramundane right livelihood. They're the ones that take only what is given and they practice the non-greed path. Now we need to see that when we have gone to work to earn money for sensual pleasures, we are like the bird who has stolen the piece of meat. And when we work and gain sensual pleasures, we are living with greed. So we end up believing that all this sensuality can last. So we assign permanency, in Pali we call this nicca, to sensual pleasures, because when we take what is not given, when we steal. So the truth is actually the opposite. Sensual pleasures, they're unlasting, impermanent. So we need to remember that we have taken what has not been given in the past, we've stolen in the past for the same reason, to gain lasting, permanent sensual pleasures. And this piece of meat, again, is this physical nutriment, just like what we saw before. We see beauty in the piece of meat, whatever it is, and we cling to it. The sensual desire for those things escalates, and we end up poisoned by the dart of lust, still seeing there's beauty in it. And so our consciousness steadies in form, and in the bigger picture, we end up going the wrong way due to desire. We want to birth again to experience these sensual pleasures. So we're bound to samsara again, the whole mass of suffering. Again, this is the real danger in sensual pleasures. So for this simile of the piece of meat and taking what is not given, we need to ask the question, is it worth taking what is not given? Is it worth it stealing for the essential pleasures that do not last, like this piece of meat, if what we can expect is rebirth in an unhappy destination? And again, the answer is no. We want to give up any desire to take what is not given and to gain, again, we want to give up breathing in to go to work tomorrow. This is what it really means, that we want to give up the desire to steal in the supramundane sense. So we recall from yesterday, we practice with the support of taking what is only given. The taking of what is not given is to be abandoned. So we need to develop this deeper understanding by contemplating this simile of the piece of meat. We want to make the determination to develop the non-greed path, and by giving up the greed path. And so that means we don't want to steal, we don't want to take, we only want to take what is given. So we've seen the truth of this piece of meat, that it's not lasting. And so we give up taking what is not given. So in the meditation, you might think, oh, but I have to go to work tomorrow. And the thing is, don't worry about the fact that one has to go to work tomorrow, but treat this as something that we're meditating, we're contemplating on right now. So right now, in this short meditation we're about to do, if you see with clear insight about this piece of meat being unlasting, and that you see that you don't want to breathe in to go to work, to steal, to take what is not given, you want to give it up for this meditation right now, that's very, very powerful. Because if you have that direct insight and you actually say, I'm not going to breathe in or breathe out to go to work, I'm not going to take what is not given because I see this piece of meat, it's just fleeting, there's nothing there, then what we do is we can again attain to the fourth jhana, the cessation of inhaling and exhaling. So again, we're replacing household joy with renunciant joy. And if we develop further, we can get to the equanimity that is unified. And based on that, we can aim for nibbāna, noble retirement. So let's do this meditation again. Do this contemplation on the simile of the piece of meat. And just take this Dhamma into the mind. Just try and connect with it. Okay, let's do a meditation for another few minutes. Okay, we can come out of the meditation now. And the third simile is the simile of the grass torch. Here the Buddha says to Potaliya, "Householder, suppose a man took a blazing grass torch and went against the wind. What do you think, householder? If that man does not quickly let go of that blazing grass torch, wouldn't that blazing grass torch burn his hand, or his arm, or some other part of his body, so that he might incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Yes, venerable sir. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus: sensual pleasures have been compared to a grass torch by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, he avoids equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, and develops equanimity that is unified based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder." So here the Buddha is holding so here a man is holding a blazing grass torch against the wind, and he'll get burnt or suffer worse unless he lets go of it. So the blazing grass torch represents sensual pleasures, and the wind represents the Four Noble Truths. So sensual pleasures, they burn us or cause suffering when we take them as mine. The wind that is blowing is the truth, that it's not mine. So while we hold on to the wrong view, we experience pain and suffering. So let's look at a few examples. When the car or house we own is burnt in a fire. When there's an accident at a school that our children attend and we think, oh, has something happened to my children? Or when we hear that a relative is in hospital. When our doctor tells us they have to amputate our leg. And so there are other examples as well. But in all the examples, if we have taken any of these sensual pleasures, so property, family, friends, colleagues, ourselves as mine, then we burn with pain, or worse, we experience death or deadly suffering. And if we haven't taken them as mine, then we don't burn in that way. So Venerable Sariputta in the Mahāniddesa says, sensual pleasures are like the grass torch because they leave a hot trail. A hot trail of what? Of pain, suffering, and despair. The truth that the Buddha tells us with the Four Noble Truths is, with sensual pleasures there is pain and suffering. And the Buddha uses this simile of the grass torch for false speech or lying, musavada. The lie we continue to believe is there is pleasure or happiness, so some kind of sukha in sensual pleasures. And that's why we take them as mine, which is another lie. And why we keep holding on to this blazing grass torch. And so we keep getting burnt. So we can see this with our own body, that we take it as mine, and when we take it as attractive or pleasing, we ignore all the impurities of the body and the fact that it ages, sickens, and will eventually die. So it's really painful. It's not pleasurable. So why do we take it as mine? So we've lied in the past for the same reason. We've done this to gain sensual pleasures as mine. So if we have the corrupt mind and we cling and, the sensual desire escalates, we end up again poisoned by the dart of lust. Consciousness keeps steady on form and we end up going the wrong way with desire, following the same unprofitable path. And so the desire is to come back for more sensual pleasures. And we remain bound to this whole mess of suffering. So the real danger in sensual pleasures can be seen here. The question to ask ourselves is it worth lying or having false speech for these sensual pleasures that are not worth taking as me and mine? That, like the blazing grass torch, if all we can expect is rebirth in an unhappy destination, is it worth it? And again, the answer is no. We want to give up any desire to lie or to have false speech to gain this kind of sensual pleasures. So we recall from yesterday we practiced with the support of truthful speech, false speech is to be abandoned. And so what we want to do with this understanding is to walk the non-greed path in order to give up the greed path. So truthful speech, having seen the truth of the blazing grass torch, is to give up false speech, lying. So how do we do this? How do we do this as a meditation? How do we realize the truth that this is not mine? We've actually meditated on this before, and it's by contemplating this body as the four great elements. So in Pali, this is known as dhatu manasikara. So the earth element, water element, wind element, fire element, And we use the instructions given by the Buddha in the Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Sutta. So we make the determination for wisdom. So remember, this is the Paññā Adhitthāna, to investigate and see the body as it really is. If we do this correctly, then we see both internally and externally the earth element as not mine, both internally and externally the water element as not mine, both internally and externally the wind element as not mine, and both internally and externally the fire element as not mine. And if you remember, we used different examples in order to see that. And so in this meditation, when we don't take any part of this body comprised of these four great elements as mine, we go beyond form and we reach infinite space or further. So we could get to infinite consciousness, plane of nothingness, or neither perception nor non-perception. So this is a really good thing, because we immediately reach what the Buddha calls the equanimity that is unified, which is here. That's what he's referring to. And so if we continue to meditate, if we also see that these formless attainments are also not mine and constructed, because after a very long time we can fall from these attainments, then we gain this insight that we want to give up craving for even these formless attainments. And so we give up greed, hatred, and delusion in all conditions. And so this is where we actually make the determination for truth, the Saḷāyatanavibhaṅga, for what is undeceptive. So this is what it really means. With the support of truthful speech, we abandon the false speech. And so where we get to is we aim for noble retirement, for nibbāna. So in this way, this is how we abandon. So let's do another short meditation of this simile of the grass torch. We want to use the support of the truth to abandon the false. So you do the meditation that we've done before, Dhatu Manasikara, to actually see all these things are not mine. Nothing in this body is mine, both internally, externally. And when you get into this meditation, if you have enough time, you actually go beyond form. And so this is very good. If you can do that even in this short meditation, that's wonderful. Okay, let's do this meditation for a little few minutes. Okay, we can come out of the meditation now. So up to this point, we have cultivated virtuous conduct by non-killing, by not taking taking only what is given, and also truthful speech. So we now come to the fourth simile, and this is the simile of the charcoal pit. Here the Buddha says to Potaliya, "Householder, suppose there were a charcoal pit deeper than a man's height, full of glowing coals without flame or smoke. Then a man came who wanted to live and not to die, who wanted pleasure and recoiled from pain. And two strong men seized him by both arms and dragged him towards the charcoal pit. What do you think, householder? Would that man twist his body this way and that? Yes, venerable sir. Why is that? Because that man knows that if he falls into that charcoal pit, he will incur death or deadly suffering because of that. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to a charcoal pit by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified based on diversity and develops the equanimity that is unified based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder. So here, a man is being dragged to a charcoal pit by these two strong men. And as they're dragging him, the man would struggle trying to break free because he knows if he falls into the charcoal pit, he'll experience death or deadly suffering. And he wants to live. He wants to experience pleasure, not pain. The charcoal pit here is full of glowing coals without flame or smoke, and this represents sensual pleasures. The two strong men are craving, so tanha on one side, and volition, cetana, on the other side. And Venerable Sariputta in the Mahanidesa says sensual pleasures are like the charcoal pit because of scorching or burning badly. So the simplest way to understand this one, and it's a very profound simile, is to recognize that we are never happy with our sensual pleasures. We constantly measure and compare, thinking there's something better than what we have. On the one arm, we have volitional formation saying, I'm holding on to pleasurable experience that I had before. And I've stamped the past pleasurable experience as permanent. And on the other arm, there is craving, seeking pleasure now. And that is, and we're seeking it so that it's the equivalent of what we've had before. That's what we're seeking. We're trying to find that. We constantly burn because the permanency we've constructed from our volitional formations is a lie. So what we experienced in the past, saying, oh, it was really good like that, and when we try and find it again, that's a lie. That permanency we've said from that past experience is a lie. And we looked at this earlier when in the simile of the piece of meat and taking what is not given, that pleasurable feeling is also a lie because it's actually painful, not pleasurable. And we looked at this in the simile of the grass torch. So let's take a few examples to try and understand this Dhamma. So when we go out to eat and say, for example, we order linguine, and while we're eating, we complain, oh, it's not as good as the linguine we had when we were in Sorrento in Italy at this little trattoria that we went to 10 years ago. Or we buy a new laptop and in the first week, we complain, oh, it's too complicated compared to the one that we had that died, but that one was perfectly configured. Or we're a widower and we start dating again, and every person we date doesn't measure up in some way to our late husband or wife. Or we go on holidays and everything is falling short. So the airline isn't as good as it was pre-COVID, or the hotel isn't as wow as before, or things seem a lot more expensive than they were, or the staff, they're not as friendly as they were, or they're not working there anymore, and the food isn't as good as the last time we had it. Or another example is we decide to have baby number 2, and when they arrive, we keep saying, oh, it wasn't like this with baby number 1. Why is baby number 2 not sleeping as well, or some other kind of issue? Or we take a job at another company that offers slightly more money, and we don't get along as well with our new boss. And so we constantly compare to someone that we worked with who was our boss maybe a few years ago, and we think, oh, this person doesn't measure up. They've got this, and so we keep coming up short. So you get the idea. Much of our life with respect to sensual pleasures is like this. If you spend time contemplating this simile, like just keep contemplating, you end up thinking, gee, I'm spending a lot of my life burning in this charcoal pit. But that's what happens when we don't see the danger in sensual pleasures. We keep measuring, comparing, splitting, separating. And so the Buddha uses this simile of the charcoal pit for divisive speech, for pisuna vacha, which is linked to the disparaging we do in our mind, the divisiveness, the palasa that we do in our mind. We constantly verbalize what we're measuring, what we're comparing, and then we split and we separate. What is true with respect to divisive speech and disparaging is we're never happy with what we have or what we experience in this present moment. For this reason, we keep seeking and demanding pleasure that we used to have. Even as an adult, we still hold on to the pleasure we had as a child. And whether we know it or not, we seek and try to match that same pleasure in the present. So we're not happy with what we have. We keep thinking, oh, there must be something better. Better food, better house, better job, better colleagues, better boss, better partner, better investments, and so on. And we never find it. So the Buddha uses this simile also for mental volition as nutriment, mano sancetana ahara. So you remember from the Potaliya Sutta that this is the third unprofitable direction. This is where we get tied to our misapprehension that we can get pleasure and make it last. The volitional formations that we have this pleasure that we had before, we're holding on to that, believing that it lasts. So this is why we go down this path and we think it's worth taking as me and mine. The truth, as we've highlighted early on, is that these are all lies. The pleasure is really pain, and the sensual pleasures, they're really unlasting. The experience of them is unlasting, impermanent, so it's not worth taking as me and mine. So this is how we can connect this Dhamma. It's very powerful Dhamma. The question to ask ourselves is it worth having divisive speech for these sensual pleasures that burn us, like the charcoal pit, if all we can expect is rebirth in an unhappy destination? And if you seriously contemplate this, the answer again is no. We want to give up any desire to have divisive speech to gain sensual pleasures. So you recall from yesterday we practiced with the support of non-divisive speech. Divisive speech is to be abandoned. So when we get a really deeper understanding of this, we make that determination to walk the non-hate path by giving up the hate path. And so we develop non-divisive speech and give up the divisive speech because we've seen the truth about burning in the charcoal pit. So if we genuinely gain insight into this particular simile, we enter the jhanas again. And so again, we're replacing household joy of the essential pleasures with renunciant joy. And if we develop further, we get to the equanimity that is unified, and then we aim for nibbāna, noble retirement. So let's do another short meditation just to take this Dhamma into our minds and try and connect as best as we can. Okay, so let's contemplate the simile of the charcoal pit. Blessings of the Triple Gem. We can come out of the meditation now. So the next simile, the fifth one, is the simile of the dream. Here the Buddha says to Potaliya, "Householder, suppose a man dreamt about lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely lakes, and on waking he saw nothing of it. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to a dream by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, he avoids equanimity that is diversified, based on diversity, and develops the equanimity that is unified, based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder." So while the man is sleeping, he dreams about all these beautiful things, and upon awakening, it all disappears. So the dream represents sensual pleasures, and we are conditioned to constantly dream about sensual pleasures from a very young age. And so our lives are driven by sensual pleasures. We dream about what we can gain in the future. When I have this, it will be great. When I have that, it will be great, and so on. So for example, when we're young, our parents tell us to study because it'll help us to gain skills or qualifications that get us a good job in the future and it will pay us well. We're told we don't want to be like the beggar on the street or some other person that isn't seen favorably, and we're told to go to school and then to college, and so we do that. Then after we graduate, we look for a job because we think, oh, if I get a good job, then it will be better. So we get a job and move out of our parents' house and we think, oh, I'll be good now. I'm earning money and I have my own place. I'll be happy living like this. And then we have to conform to the work hours and only take lunch at the set times and report to a manager, and then there are bills to pay and not enough money left over. And then we might think, oh, but it was better living with my parents. There's no bills and I get to eat home-cooked food every night. My mom's cooking. But then we get a promotion at work, and so we start earning a bit more money, and with the extra money we buy a new car and take out a mortgage on a house and so on. And we also get some investment advice on buying shares and diversifying into other areas, and then we start worrying about protecting our wealth and property, and at work we're now having to manage people, and then we have to deal with that stress. And then our parents pester us and say, oh, it's time to get married. You know, everybody else is getting married. Your cousin got married and so got married. And because we dream of the perfect relationship, we eventually find a partner and we get married. And then all of our friends are also getting married and having kids. And so we have kids too. And so more people to take care of, more bills, more juggling for years. And by the time we really look at what's happened, we've aged. And the next thing is we're bound to death. And so if you really understand what the Buddha is showing us with this simile of the dream, we are like the man who sleeps, dreams of sensual pleasures, and wakes up to find out that it's disappeared. This is like death, craving for sensual pleasures, and then we're reborn to discover that there's nothing. So that's why Venerable Sariputta in the Mahāniddesa says, sensual pleasures are like the dream because of their transience. It's so fleeting. It's as if there's nothing there. So the Buddha uses this simile of the dream for greed and covetousness, giri-lobha. So what we need to see is that our desire for sensual pleasures is really an ignoble search. So if you remember, we learned about these ignoble searches when we were doing the 5 subjects for frequent contemplation. The first one is someone who is themselves subject to old age seeks only what is subject to old age. The second is someone who is themselves subject to illness seeks only what is subject to illness. The third is someone who is themselves subject to death seeks only what is subject to death. And the last one is someone who is themselves subject to defilement seeks only what is subject to defilement. So what we desire and find in sensual pleasures is really what is subject to old age, sickness and death and defilement. It's perverse, isn't it? And not what we think we are delighting in when we dream of sensual pleasures. So this applies to all the people, the property, and whatever is the physical nutriment, including ourselves. And what is this delight when we're dreaming? Well, the delight in the bigger picture sense is wanting to be born again for these sensual pleasures, the dream. So when we take delight, we're really seeking rebirth for those things. And there's nothing there. And what is driving this kind of thinking is that we think that there's something substantial rather than nothing. We think it's substantial, we think it's valuable to get this gain. And so this is what the Buddha calls stinginess for gain, labha macharya in Pali. And we're familiar with this term because we meditate on macharya, this stinginess, in the Alagaddūpama Sutta. But this simile of the dream is showing us that what we're stingy for to gain are these sensual pleasures that are subject to old age, sickness, and death. They're transient, they're hollow. It's illusory, like the dream. There's no substance there. It's even like the mirage that the Buddha talks about when he talks about mano-sancetana, and it's based on perception. So this is our real dream, going from birth to birth, seeking pleasure, believing it will be better next time, next birth. So that's why we're pleasure seekers, who don't see this greed and covetousness can only lead to a whole mass of suffering over and over. Do we know any person that only experiences happiness and pleasure that lasts? That isn't hollow? That isn't illusory? No, because everyone's dreams are the same. They're subject to old age, sickness, and death, and defilement. Therefore, the question to ask ourselves is this: is it worth having greed and covetousness for the essential pleasures that disappear, like the dream, if what we can expect is rebirth in an unhappy destination? And again, the answer should be no. We want to give up any desire to have greed and covetousness to gain sensual pleasures. So we recall again from yesterday, we practice together with the support of no greed and covetousness. Greed and covetousness is to be abandoned. So if we get this really deeper understanding, we make the determination for the non-greed path and give up the greed path. So we develop no greed and covetousness, having seen the truth about the dream, and we give up greed and covetousness. If we do so, again, we can enter the jhanas because we are going beyond the form. Well, that's what we want to end up with. But we replace household joy with renunciant joy and develop further. And so we aim for noble retirement, for nibbāna. So let's do this meditation together. So this simile of the dream. And let's try and connect with this Dhamma again to see that we don't want to have this greed and covetousness. So we cultivate no greed and covetousness, understanding that the dream is transient, fleeting. There's nothing there. And so we don't want to be greedy for something that's going to bring us back for more of the same, and even worse, to come to an unhappy destination. So let's do this meditation for another few minutes. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Okay, we can come out of the meditation now. So we now come to the sixth simile, and this is the simile of the borrowed goods. Here the Buddha says to Potaliya, householder, suppose a man borrowed goods on loan, a fancy carriage and fine jeweled earrings, and preceded and surrounded by those borrowed goods, he went to the marketplace. Then people seeing him would say, sirs, that is a rich man, that is how the rich enjoy their wealth. Then the owners, whenever they saw him, would take back their things. What do you think, householder? Would that be enough for that man to become dejected? Yes, venerable sir, why is that? Because the owners took back their things. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to borrowed goods by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified, based on diversity, and develops the equanimity that is unified, based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder. So here a man goes into town surrounded by those borrowed goods, and people think he's wealthy, and whenever they see him, the owners of those borrowed goods take back their things. When this happens, the man becomes depressed or dejected. So the borrowed goods represent sensual pleasures. Now, Venerable Sariputta in the Mahanidesa says sensual pleasures are like the borrowed goods because they are temporary. Now, the way to understand this is how we behave when we leave the house. So most of us make sure we're dressed well, our hair is styled, and maybe we've even accessorized. There are all the nice things, so the good clothes, the fancy watch, jewelry, expensive bag or wallet, and then we get into a nice car and meet up at a fancy restaurant. And we want people to think he or she, depending on what we are, then looks really nice, or they're doing very well. They look very wealthy. They look like they're having a really good life. So this is how we construct and live our lives, whether we do it consciously or not. Society is also constructed this way, with all the marketing and influencers and celebrities and elite families, royalty, all that. So we're highly conditioned by society and the world that we inhabit. And remember, this is a sensual realm. When we're young, we may flaunt our youth, show more skin by the way we dress, but as we age, we cover it up with colorful clothes, expensive jewelry, other adornments, or we have surgery and different things to make sure it looks better than it really is. And it's like when we're young, which is a very limited time, we're like the shiny thing that everyone gravitates towards. But with aging, the shine starts to wane, so we use something else to replace the shine. In our youth, we get very conceited about that. We lift the mind holding on to the physical nutriment as beautiful or pleasing, so we think it's suba, not seeing that this very useful thing is already aging. And then as we age, we become more conceited about sensual pleasures that we use to adorn or to add to the physical nutriment. And as I said, maybe we use Botox or we have plastic surgery. It's all to cover up the pleasure or cover up the signs of aging. So we lift our mind holding on to this physical nutriment in this way with all the added things or the changes we've made. We still seek pleasure this way. So what we're really believing is that we get pleasure from this physical nutriment. We delight in it and we lift the mind with conceit. Look at me, I've got all these things. Or look at how I look. So the Buddha uses this simile of the borrowed goods for insulting with anger, ninda rosa. The borrowed goods are the good clothes, the jewelry, the handbag, the watches, the houses, the cars, other things, or even the changes we make in order to show something. So we have conceit over our borrowed things. To meditate on this, we need to see how we lift the mind with conceit. I mean, conceit is in all these things, but in particular with this one, This is explained by Venerable Mahācattārīsaka when he was explaining some of the Buddha's words in short, and he was explaining them in detail to the bhikkhus. This is from the Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Sutta. We've been through this sutta before, at least first pass of the sutta. But when you go more deeply into the Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Sutta, what we see is it's because we take these borrowed goods, so any kind of borrowed goods, the jewelry, the cars, whatever, it's still the physical nutriment. We take it as beauty or pleasing, subha. We expect pleasure, so sukha, from it. And because of that, we take it as mine. So we've heard this before. And when we take it as mine, what we do is we start making plans with these borrowed goods. And we end up clinging to a sense of self because of it. In Pali, the word that Buddha uses here is attavadu upadana. So that's translated as well as self-theory clinging. And as a result, we lie and do all kinds of wrong things. So let's take an example. When we construct this life, we acquire all these borrowed goods that are pleasing to us, expecting to experience pleasure. So the clothes, the car, the house, the gadgets, even the holidays we take, the sports that we follow, the entertainment that we consume, and so on. And we show the world that we're happy, living a good life. That's how we start to insult with anger. And we take all those things as mine. I am that person with all the good stuff. I travel to all these places and I experience all these things with so much pleasure. And we don't even reveal anything about the pain and suffering that is attached to that. And we think, next time I'll go here and I'll get this and I'll do this. And we cling to the same thing. I'm this person who can do this in the future and will do this, and so on. And so we tell people all these lies, clinging to these views and making that kind of unwholesome conduct. So this is what it really means about insulting with anger. That's what it's really like. And so we keep breeding conceit with borrowed goods that are temporary. In this process, what we see is we've lost the right view and we're holding on to the wrong view. And we also have misconduct instead of virtuous conduct. So we know from the Vyasana Sutta that it's because of loss of virtue or the loss of right view that sentient beings, when their body breaks up after death, they're reborn in a place of loss, a bad place, the underworld, hell. So the question, just like the other ones we need to ask, is it worth insulting with anger for these sensual pleasures that are temporary, just like the borrowed goods, if all that we can expect is rebirth in an unhappy destination? And so if you understand this, the answer is no. And we want to give up any desire to insult with anger to gain sensual pleasures. And so again, from yesterday we said, with the support of not insulting with anger is to be abandoned. So there's a deeper understanding to this, that we make that determination to develop non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, because it touches on all three. And by giving up greed, hatred, and delusion. So this is how we develop not insulting with anger, having seen the truth about the borrowed goods, and we give up insulting with anger. So when we do this, we can enter into the jhanas, replacing household joy with renunciant joy again, and we can develop further, as we've said. So let's do another little meditation. It's our second last one. And this is the simile of the borrowed goods, and to really see that we don't want to insult with anger. All these borrowed goods are transient. There's nothing there. They're temporary. So let's do this meditation, make this determination, because by the end of it, what we have developed is the right physical conduct, the right verbal conduct, and now the right mental conduct with these 6 things. Okay, blessings of the Triple Gem. Let's do this meditation. Okay, we can come out of our short meditation. So we come to the seventh and final simile, which is the simile of fruits on a tree. And here the Buddha says to Potaliya, "Householder, suppose there were a dense grove not far from some village or town, within which there was a tree laden with fruit, but none of its fruit had fallen to the ground. Then a man came needing fruit, seeking fruit, wandering in search of fruit, and he entered the grove and saw the tree laden with fruit. Thereupon he thought, 'This tree is laden with fruit, but none of its fruit has fallen to the ground. I know how to climb a tree, so let me climb this tree, eat as much fruit as I want, and fill my bag.' And he did so. Then a second man came needing fruit, seeking fruit, wandering in search of fruit, and taking a sharp axe, he too entered the grove and saw that tree laden with fruit. Thereupon he thought, 'This tree is laden with fruit, but none of its fruit has fallen to the ground. I do not know how to climb a tree, so let me cut this tree down at its root, eat as much fruit as I want, and fill my bag.' And he did so. What do you think, householder? If that first man who had climbed the tree doesn't come down quickly, when the tree falls, wouldn't he break his hand or his foot or some other part of his body, so that he might incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Yes, Venerable Sir. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to fruits on a tree by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified, based on diversity, and develops equanimity that is unified based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder. Here a man wants fruit and sees the tree with lots of fruit, and there's no fruit that's fallen to the ground. So he climbs the tree to get the fruit. And while he's up in the tree, a second man comes along, also wanting fruit, but he can't climb the tree, so he decides to cut it down and get the fruit that way. Now, if the first person doesn't come down quickly, then they'll experience death or deadly suffering. So the fruits on a tree represent sensual pleasures. And with this simile, the Buddha is showing us that we are that first person who has climbed the tree to get the fruit. And what comes along is sickness. This is the second man that comes along, and it will become clearer when we go through. When we think we can live with our sensual pleasures, so these fruits, we don't see that sickness comes along. So sickness comes in many forms, as the Buddha has explained. We recently referenced Girimananda in the 5 subjects to frequently contemplate. And what happens is, the Buddha says, because this body is the source of much pain and danger for all kinds of afflictions that arise in this body, and the Buddha lists out many afflictions. And then as well, illnesses are produced by change of climate, illnesses produced by careless behavior, illnesses produced by assault, or illnesses produced as a result of karma, and so on. And so we know with sickness, what comes with sickness? Death. So this is why Venerable Sariputta in Mahanidesa says sensual pleasures are like the fruits on a tree because of breaking off and damaging. This final simile brings together the other ones as well. In fact, you can see a gradual progression as we meditate sequentially through them, reinforcing this right view and showing how we stay bonded to samsara, this whole mass of suffering, by misconduct and also by conceit over this misconduct, and how they keep escalating through each other. So this final simile of the fruits in a tree is showing how we get to this point after seeing the truth, even in all these similes. So we've given up all this misconduct. So we've given up killing living beings, taking what is not given up false speech, divisive speech, greed, covetousness, and insulting with anger. So we've perfected our physical conduct, our verbal conduct, and our mental conduct. But now what we're saying is we're just living with the fruits from a tree and taking a little pleasure. So what this is saying is, when we live like this, we believe that we won't get sick. We don't see it coming. And so what really happens is we still don't get what we want, which is we want permanent happiness, living with this little bit of fruit. And because we are subject to sickness and then death, we don't get what we want. So remember the definition of the first noble truth of suffering, and it says at the end of it, Yampi chang nalapati tampi dukkhang in Pali, which translates as not getting what one wants is suffering. So again, this is painful. It's not pleasurable. This is why the Buddha uses the simile of the fruits on a tree for affliction with anger. So even if we don't harm, we give up our misconduct and we're living with our remaining sensual pleasures, what we get is still affliction with anger. We still live with hate. So for example, say we've conventionally retired and we're living on our pension and assets, and we've learned some of the Buddha's teachings, and we start to keep our precepts, maybe even slightly closer to what Buddha is saying here, but not quite, because we're learning this now. And we're only indulging in a little bit of sensual pleasures. And so we might have this conceit that life is good like this. I've given up this much and I'm happy. So this is similar to what Potaliya was saying at the beginning of this discourse. Yet, what are we faced with? Well, we have ailments that come to the body, all kinds of headaches or illnesses or weakness in the limbs or high blood pressure or various little things or big things. So what we get when we face these things is the sickness. And when we get that, what do? We have this affliction or association with anger. Now, if we meditate and get to the higher concentrations, this is also how we live with more subtle fruits. So we are now saying when we get to the higher concentrations, I can abide with these higher concentrations. So space is infinite, or infinite consciousness, or emptiness, or neither perception nor non-perception. And we say to ourselves, I'm so happy. And so we get conceited about this too. And this is delusion. Why is this delusion? Because we have this deluded thinking saying these higher concentrations will last. And we think, I'm living with non-hate because I can abide in these formless attainments for a very long time. But then, even though these higher concentrations last for a very long time, and they are pleasurable, and we have inner calm, we come to realize that they don't last. They are still constructed. And so when we fall from these things, we're still afflicted with anger as well. And we've been living with delusion and hate. So in the Pethakopadesa, there's a nice thing, like a definition for non-hate that says in Pali, Yang ajatarato samahito ti vikepa patisaharana ayam adoso. So in Pali, what that translates to is we have inward joy and calm, having removed disturbances. So that's what non-hate means. Now, we can't say that here because we're still living with hate, because we have the delusion that even with higher concentrations, that if we think that they'll last, we eventually fall from them, or we realize they're constructed and we still become afflicted with anger. So that doesn't fulfill that definition. And still having this body, we would be afflicted with sickness and therefore death. So this is a very important point when it comes to this deeper Dhamma, because this is how we cling to our Dhamma, like the Dhamma around getting to the higher meditations, higher concentrations. This is our Dhammamacharya, stinginess due to the Dhamma. So if we're able to see this point, then what we give up here is we give up those higher concentrations. So there's a sequential thing where we give up the sensual pleasures and this wrong idea about our misconduct, and we give up the higher concentrations, which is the subtle fruit, and we give up this stinginess for the Dhamma that got us to those higher concentrations. Now, why do we do this? Because we want Nibbāna. So we want the noble retirement. So what we see in the Buddha's 8 things and these similes is we began with killing and living with hate. That's the first thing that we went through. And now we end with affliction with anger, and we see we're still living with hate. So our whole life starts with hate and it ends with hate. This is our whole life. And in between is all this misconduct. So that's our life in a nutshell. And when we look at it, if we don't practice as the Buddha is instructing, then we're likely to go back for more of the same. That's why it's so important to develop this Noble Eightfold Path. We need to penetrate this Dhamma. So again, the question we ask to contemplate this simile of the fruits in a tree is it really worth having affliction with anger for these sensual pleasures that are sick and will die, like the gross or subtle fruits on a tree? If all we can expect, even after we get to the formless attainments, or if those sorts of things, that we can expect rebirth in an unhappy destination. So again, the answer is no. So we want to give up any desire for affliction with anger to gain sensual pleasures. And so we practice with the support of non-affliction with anger, we abandon affliction with anger. And so we want to walk the non-hate, non-delusion path. We give up the hate and delusion paths. And so if we genuinely give up or genuinely have this direct insight, we can immediately go to the seventh jhana. And this, of course, replaces household joy with renunciant joy. It's a very, very good meditation. And of course, we go for Nibbana. So it's at this point that the mind is very, very purified. We can recollect our past lives when it's very purified like this, particularly in the seventh jhana. This is one of those 3 accomplishments in knowledge that the Buddha talks about in his teaching Potaliya in this sutta. Recollecting past lives is a great equalizer as an attainment, because we get to see that our conceit is based on nothing. We're able to see that we've been conceited, and we see these past lives and the magnitude of our journey. It's all built on misconduct. And so that's what it means to be the great equalizer. But we'll come to that just after we do this short meditation. So let's now contemplate the simile of the fruits in a tree just for a few minutes, and then we'll finish off this sutta just to summarize and see where we are. So let's do this meditation for another few minutes, and then we'll complete our study of this sutta. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Okay, we can come out of our last meditation. And as trainees, the Buddha and the Noble Arahants do encourage us to become accomplished in the three knowledges. So it's possible for both lay people and monastic to attain these knowledges if they maintain the jhana concentration. So the more stable the jhana concentration, the better to do so. So the meditations in Potaliya Sutta are very good for doing this, because you really, if you understand these similes really well and you really practice them, it's very, very strong concentration, particularly for some of these meditations. And it's also the case where some meditators may not be able to attain these knowledges until they realize arahantship. So it's a little bit different for everyone. And then when one realizes the fruit of arahantship, then they all come at once. So for some meditators, it's more easy, and for others, it's not. And sometimes it's because these have been practiced in previous births. So there's certain parami that is there for certain meditators. So I won't read this out, but I've actually been through these three knowledges in just slightly more detail, particularly for the first one and the second one. And this was from the Deveda Vitakka Sutta. This is Majjhima Nikaya Discourse number 19, and the talk was titled Skilled Thoughts, Jhana and the Right Path. So I recommend looking into that. There's also a shorter extract on these three knowledges as well, so you don't have to go through the whole thing again. So that's also available. So there's recollecting past lives. There's also seeing beings passing away and reappearing. So this is what the Buddha talks about in relation to developing the divine eye. And this is also really good in terms of if you have idhipadas, so the bases of power, then it's much easier to also use the divine eye, develop the divine eye, sorry. And then the last one is the liberation and destruction of the taints. So this is really the Buddha saying, based upon that, the same supreme mindfulness whose purity is due to equanimity. So what we develop by the end of meditating on the 7 similes of the Potaliya Sutta, this is where we get to, by realizing for himself with direct knowledge, this noble disciple here and now enters upon and abides in the deliverance of mind and deliverance by wisdom that are taintless with the destruction of the taint. So you get the knowledge. And the Buddha is talking about liberation of mind. So in Pali, this is Ceto Vimutti, and liberation by wisdom, Panya Vimutti. So we've discussed this a little bit in some of our sessions before. Now, if or when we go to these liberations, this is when you can stop the mind. So if you've seen with what we've done so far, when you stop killing living beings, you stop taking what is not given. This is the development of the body, so bhavita kaya, and we have good physical conduct. Then you have the giving up of false speech, and you give up the divisive speech. Then you have good verbal conduct. So what happens is you have the bhavita sila, development of virtue. And so when we give up greed and covetousness and the insulting with anger, then what happens is we develop the good mental conduct. So we have the bhavita chitta and development of the mind. And so with the last two, which is arrogance, and the simile that we looked at was about affliction with anger, there what we're actually looking at is wisdom, development of wisdom, bhavata panya. So this is how we stop the mind. All 4 things are how we develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's a natural progression that we get to Ceto Vimutti and Panya Vimutti. So this is when you really see, you reflect on the Buddha's words, his instructions, sequentially, gradually, and correctly. You bend to the Buddha's words, like you're easy to instruct, willing to follow. So this is how you develop the Noble Eightfold Path. Isn't it marvelous? So when the mind stops, what this is like, it's complete stillness. There's no narrative about what's happening, what's going on, how you got there, will you get out, nothing like that. It's simply quiet, simply still. And when it happens, it's very, very strong. And so when you come out of it, it stays with you for a while as well. For depending on how long you spend in it, it will actually sort of be when you come out, that's also how long it will remain with you, or longer, depending on how powerful it is. So this is really what it means to develop the body, develop virtue, develop mind, develop wisdom, and properly generate the Noble Eightfold Path. So if we keep training with this, using the Buddhist similes, then we eventually achieve noble retirement entirely, and in all ways we attain Nibbana. So after giving this teaching, the Buddha then asked Potaliya, "At this point, householder, the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline has been achieved entirely and in all ways. What do you think, householder? Do you see in yourself any cutting off of affairs like this cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline when it is achieved entirely and in all ways?" And Potaliya gives a very lengthy answer. And what he says is, "Venerable Sir, who am I that I should possess any cutting off of affairs entirely and in all ways like that in the Noble One's discipline?" And this is probably what we would say as well. "I am far indeed, Venerable Sir, from that cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline when it has been achieved entirely in all ways. For, Venerable Sir, though the wanderers of other sects are not thoroughbreds, we imagine that they are thoroughbreds. Though they are not thoroughbreds, we fed them the food of thoroughbreds. Though they are not thoroughbreds, we set them in the place of thoroughbreds." So he's revealing that he followed other teachers, followed their teachings, and treated them really well, and set them in, high places and with a lot of respect. And then he says, "But though the bhikkhus are thoroughbreds, we imagine that they are not thoroughbreds. Though they are thoroughbreds, we fed them the food of those who are not thoroughbreds. Though they are thoroughbreds, we set them in place of those who are not thoroughbreds." So he's admitting that he hasn't treated the Buddha and his noble disciples all that well, and we've probably done the same as well. "But now, Venerable Sir, as the wanderers of other sects are not thoroughbreds, we shall understand that," and so on. But as the bhikkhus are thoroughbreds, we shall understand that they are thoroughbreds, and so on. And so he's correcting himself, as we would do as well. "So, Venerable Sir, the Blessed One has inspired me love for recluses, confidence in recluses, reverence for recluses or ascetics. Magnificent Master Gautama, magnificent Master Gautama, Master Gautama has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what is hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms." Now, isn't that the same sentiment we have after going through this wonderful sutta? And then he says, "I go to Master Gautama for refuge, and to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha of bhikkhus. From today, let Master Gautama remember me as a lay follower who has gone to him for refuge for life." Gosh, I feel the same way too. So, we have now come to the end of our two-part study of the Potaliya Sutta for this session. The encouragement is to make effort to gradually learn and practice the Buddha's powerful teachings on these similes. As we said earlier, the way to learn and practice these similes after this session is to go through them slowly. Don't feel daunted that you didn't understand everything. Just try to understand one by one, and then also learn and practice them all together. Because as we've shown by going through it, there's a very powerful insight pathway in this sutta, and we're meant to meditate on it so that the mind stops in the correct way. So previously we've been stopping the mind without the right view, without having developed the body, virtue, the mind and wisdom. So we would get, if we stop the mind in this way, a true taste of Nibbana. So the more we practice and gain insight in our meditation, the more we get closer to noble retirement and the true safety and happiness of Nibbana. So it won't be easy, as we've said, but the benefit is substantial, particularly with respect to overcoming misconduct and the conceit that pervades our life. So this is all what blocks noble attainment, noble retirement, Nibbana. So very, very powerful teaching, and we're so very fortunate to have spent some time together going through it. So let's now express our gratitude to the Buddha for these powerful teachings. Let's now in our mind also express gratitude to our other teachers who have helped us to this point, our parents, all our good Kalyana Mitras, our good friends who encourage us towards the Noble Eightfold Path. And if you would like to dedicate any merit to any departed relatives, do so now. And we can share the merits of our wholesome time together with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. And I wish you blessings of the Triple Gem. Wish you all well. May you continue to find happiness in the Buddha's teachings, develop on the Noble Eightfold Path, and grow in wholesome qualities.